The Mafia were one of the most dangerous and secret criminal organizations in the world. Their activities began on the Italian island of Sicily and were soon exported to America, where it became La Cosa Nostra. In a century of great world wars and political assassinations, the Mafia came to play a key role in the game of history. Back and forth in time and space between Italy and America, the footsteps of the great Mafia bosses can be traced. The great dons that became known as Godfathers. In Sicily in 1893, 31-year-old Vito Cascioferro, who had been affiliated with the Mafia in his early 20s, was now a so-called man of honor. In the late 19th century, the Mafia was a secret, mysterious society that was feared by the local peasants. No one even dared call it Mafia. But in the rural community, a new social movement had begun to evolve called the Sicilian Fasci. It spoke of justice, progress, and democracy. Because of its success in the countryside, Cascioferro understood that this movement could make him even more powerful. He infiltrated the Sicilian Fasci, posing as a socialist. He clutched the hammer and sickle, along with a shotgun and images of the Madonna. Little did it matter to him that the Sicilian Fasci fought against landowners and against the mafiosi. Eventually, the government of Rome sent in the army. As the result of the military repression, more than 100 people died. Hundreds more were wounded and arrested, and the Sicilian Fasci were banned. The defeat brought the dreamers to their knees, and many left for the New World. Those who stayed went back to working the land. In America, Vito Cascioferro took off his socialist mask and set out to use all his power to become a godfather, Don Vito. In New Orleans in 1890, two Mafia families, the Matrangas and the Provenzanos, had been fighting over control of the docks, an essential front for their criminal business, a port of entrance for illegal trafficking.
They call it a family probably to soften it. It's not a family, it's a illegal business organization in which a group of men pledge loyalty to each other, divide up different areas of business, and divide up the profits that they're making.
In the streets of New Orleans, the Mafia had a legitimate front selling oranges. In 1888, the Matranga and the Provenzano families had started their fight over control of the docks.
These families exist to make money. They will resort to anything in order to continue their criminal operations, up to and including murder. In many cases, even murdering innocent people who aren't even involved in the criminal operations.
Between 1888 and 1890, over 40 people were killed in the so-called War of the Oranges. Among the victims was New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy, who had been investigating Mafia activities in the area. A public outcry followed his assassination. In March 1891, a dozen Sicilians were suspected of his murder and arrested. The angry mob stormed the jail where the suspects were held, dragged them onto the street, and lynched them. A headline in The Item, a local New Orleans newspaper, read, "Justice is done." American President Benjamin Harrison, however, expressed his personal outrage and gave $25,000 to the family of each lynched man. The rival families went into hiding.
Every family withdrew into its shell, applying the Mafia proverb that says, Bend back like a rush until the flood passes.
The War of the Oranges weakened the Mafia families. Too many picciotti, or soldiers, had died. Too much energy had been spent in the clashes rather than on racketeering, prostitution and gambling.
To
Cosa Nostra, a war is absolutely no game. It's something you engage in only if unavoidable. It is in the DNA of Cosa Nostra to avoid any internal clash, because it would mean an opportunity for the police to investigate and fight them. For centuries, Sicily hadn't had a government. It had always been a land of conquest, dominated by the Greeks, the Arabs, the Normans, the Spanish. None of them had been remotely interested in the Sicilians, their welfare or protection. Men like Don Vito Cascioferro replaced the government using favors and violence as godfathers.
Why godfather? Why padrino? Because their authority is so complete. It's like a dictatorship. You know, there's no legislature, there's no rule-making body, they don't consult, they don't go to the flock, they don't go to the voters, it's the boss. The boss says what's right, the boss says what's wrong, and people follow him.
Don Vito wanted to be invisible in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the people, he wanted to be known as the friend of all friends.
A mafia godfather is like everyone's father. He is recognized by the lowest ranks as the man who administers justice and fixes wrongdoings. He is a man you can turn to for a job.
Don Vito Cascioferro didn't carry a gun. His weapons were cynicism and intelligence. But those caught in the Godfather's net knew every favor had to be repaid.
But we also can't forget that if the old Godfather's orders were not obeyed, he issued a death sentence.
In 1902, 40-year-old Don Vito Cascioferro passed through Ellis Island, blending in with the other immigrants. He wanted to become a player in illegal business like gambling, prostitution, human trafficking, and wanted control of racketeering in the United States. He started in New York City's East Harlem. In America, many of the Italian gangsters belonged to an organization called the Black Hand. This did not prevent them from clashing with each other over control of criminal activity, as in New Orleans. Don Vito saw his chance for real power lay in peace among all the factions. He started to build alliances between gangs of the Black Hand. Extortion was bread and butter to the Black Hand. Victims were told to pay up to avoid being kidnapped or even murdered. The Black Hand even had the audacity to extort the famous Italian tenor Enrico Caruso. Following his debut in November 1903 with Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletto, Caruso started performing at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City on a regular basis. In 1907, after one show, the tenor found a note in his dressing room in Italian. The Black Hand demanded $2,000 for his life. Caruso paid, but then a second note arrived. This time, the demand was for $15,000. The extent of criminal activities perpetrated by the Black Hand led the New York Police Department to create an elite corps of Italian-American undercover officers, the Italian branch. Its chief was Lieutenant Joe Petrosino. He had come to New York from Italy with his family at the age of 13 and enrolled in the New York Police Department 10 years later. In 1905, Police Commissioner and future President Theodore Roosevelt appointed him sergeant. As the lieutenant in charge of the Italian branch, his ambition was to defeat the Mafia, which he saw as bringing shame to his mother country and fellow countrymen. Joe Petrosino convinced Enrico Caruso to set a trap to catch his blackmailers. Despite such setbacks, it was business as usual for the Black Hand, criminal business that was even reflected on the screen by directors like D.W. Griffith in the early days of motion pictures. Meanwhile, Don Vito Cascioferro put his most trusted men in key positions in New York. He needed to be able to commute back and forth between America and Italy. Sicily was changing, and his business was in trouble. In Italy in 1890, Emanuele Nortabartolo, general manager of the Banco di Sicilia, realized his bank was laundering dirty money for the Mafia. He tried to stop it and was sacked, but went on investigating alone. To stop him, on February the 1st, 1893, they stabbed him to death on a train. The person accused of instigating the murder was an Italian member of parliament, Raffaele Palizzolo. But behind him was the great godfather, Don Vito Cascioferro, who had had Palizzolo elected and pulled his strings. In the first major trial against the Mafia held in Bologna in 1902, Deputy Palizzolo was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison. But then Don Vito Cascioferro used his godfather authority. The most influential members of Sicilian society began to mobilize, accusing the Italian government of discriminating against Sicily. Lawyers brought the case to the Supreme Court of Appeal. Palizzolo was acquitted in 1904 for lack of evidence. Don Vito Cascioferro organized a triumphant return to Palermo for Palizzolo. Then, in 1908, sent him to America. Assemblies were organized in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New Orleans. Wherever he went, Palizzolo gave the same speech. He said they had to form a Sicilian organization, an actual government within the government, with its own laws. That speech was written by Don Vito, with phrases that had a double meaning, which only the Mafia could understand. Sicilians need to know how to engage in politics, said Palizzolo. What he meant was, godfathers must know how to engage in politics in order to become really powerful. Joe Petrosino understood the Sicilian dialect. He understood the coded message hidden behind the innocent words.
The important thing about Petrosino is that he was quintessential anti-mafia, and that if you did an analysis of the Italian-American experience, the children, the sons and daughters of those giants, the immigrants, and they were giants, the numbers would show you that there is a great, great disproportion. There are many more Joe Petrosino types.
Petrosino discovered that the man pulling the strings of racketeering was not really based in America, but in the Mafia heartland of Sicily. In 1909, he left for Palermo on a top-secret mission. But on the 20th of February 1909, the New York Herald broke the story. His investigation was secret no more. Petrosino ignored the obvious danger. But Don Vito Cascioferro was ahead of the game. On the 12th of March 1909, Joe Petrosino was shot and killed in Palermo's Piazza Marina.
There was a funeral in Manhattan for him, and I think over 250,000 people at that time went to that funeral. He was the first Italian American to be killed in the line of duty.
Villalba, a remote village in southern Sicily. Calogero Vizzini had 4 priests in his family, among whom were his brothers Don Salvatore and Don Giovanni, as priests are addressed in Italy. Calogero was born in 1877. At 17, he had his first brush with the law when he was charged with assault. He too aspired to the title of Don, but in its criminal sense, as the mark of respect due to a true godfather.
There were pretensions of grandeur in the Mafia, you know, the idea that they were recreating the Roman legions, and that maybe that insulated some of them from the reality of the fact that they were pretty vicious common criminals.
In 1891, from the Vatican, Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Rerum Novarum, a papal document whose title meant "of new things." It was truly the era of new things, not only in Italy, but in most of the Western world. Big machines, powerful ships, impressive dams. In their sermons, the 4 priests in Don Vizzini's families cried out against the exploitation of women and children, who were paying the highest price for progress in Italy. Among the many new things, one thing stayed the same. Sicily had no proper government to take care of the Sicilians. Don Vizzini pretended to be a unionist and gave jobs to the unemployed.
The life of Vizzini has been very peculiar. He never got married. His only interest was power, the reverence. That's one of the characteristics of a godfather. A godfather becomes powerful when he is able to have his orders carried out.
In New York City in the mid-20s, Joe Masseria was the most powerful godfather in town. He preferred to be called the boss. It sounded more American to him. Reporting to Masseria were soldiers like Salvatore Lucania, the young boy who had come to America in 1906, Carlo Gambino, and Vito Genovese. They were called the Young Turks.
When the mafia is at its strongest, those destined to be men of honor are given a specific kind of education. It's a school.
When the First World War broke out, the Mafia was ready for it. Italy called its emigrants home. Instead of going back, many hid, afraid of losing the job they had found in America. They asked for help, and the godfathers were ready with favors. When America entered the war in 1916, they poured money into Italy for new armaments. This time, many Italian Americans enlisted. Don Calogero Vizzini quickly seized the opportunity. He rustled horses, mules and donkeys and sold them to the army. But the bigger business was elsewhere. The weapons of the First World War required sulfur. Sicily had a monopoly on sulfur, and Don Vizzini owned enormous mines. His men worked like slaves, naked so that they could bear the heat. He became more and more powerful. The end of the First World War left the European economy in ruins. In America, though, the Mafia was still making money. The godfather of Chicago was Big Jim Colosimo. To protect his criminal business, he recruited a clever and cynical mafioso, Johnny Torrio. Linking up with Torrio turned out to be Big Jim Colosimo's biggest mistake. On January the 16th, 1920, the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, went into effect in the United States. There was money to be made. In Chicago, Johnny Torrio immediately saw this opportunity, but his boss, Big Jim Colosimo, did not. Johnny Torrio recruited a violent young man from Chicago, not brilliant, but smart enough to get the job done, Alphonse Capone. Five months after Prohibition began, Big Jim Colosimo was dead. Torrio, along with Capone, took over trafficking in alcohol. While Capone was power-hungry and visible, Johnny the Brain worked backstage to prevent clashes between the gangs. Everyone would get a piece of the action if the right agreement could be reached, but it couldn't. On the 24th of January 1925, he was riddled with bullets and slipped into a coma. Alone at the helm, Al Capone was highly visible. If Johnny the Brain had been around, he would never have let Capone wreak havoc in Chicago with the 1929 Valentine's Day massacre. One of the hitmen, Frank Frigenti, many years later described the carnage.
Four of us went in on Valentine's Day. We arrived at 1 o'clock. They were in the garage. We went in with a submachine gun and blew them away. We were dressed like cops because that gang didn't want to be led by Al Capone.
Al Capone could only vaguely understand what it meant to be a godfather. He knew that a godfather needed recognition and respect, so he opened up a soup kitchen for the unemployed during the Depression. He bragged about being an employer and paying many people's wages. He wanted to think big like a real godfather, but he was just showing off. He never imagined that he'd end up in Alcatraz for a trivial thing like not filing a tax return. and had no idea that one day syphilis would destroy his mind. In New York City in the mid-1920s, before leaving for Sicily once more, Don Vito Cascioferro ordered his lieutenant Salvatore Maranzano to stay in town and take care of his business.
You'd think that the most successful Italians were the ones who got to be capo de tutti i capi, but that's not true. And it was improbable, because a generation ago, 2 generations ago, the people who came here were mostly very humble and modest of means.
Don Vito's choice of Maranzano did not please Joe the Boss Masseria, who was the most powerful godfather in town. He knew that in Maranzano he could have a true rival for control of the American families. Both Maranzano and Masseria bolstered their gangs, enlisting new soldiers from Castellammare del Golfo, a beautiful place in Sicily that had become a base for new trafficking. In 1928, when the new Italian fascist regime came down heavily on the Mafia in Sicily, Don Vito Cascioferro was arrested on smuggling charges. With his boss in prison, Maranzano decided the time had come to take over. But he wasn't ready to become a godfather, and the biggest war in the underworld broke out, the Castellamarese War. In one of those clashes, on the 16th of October 1929, one of Masseria's men, Salvatore Lucania, was hit. The killers had left him hanging on a hook, pierced through his throat, convinced he was dead. But Lucania survived and got a new nickname, Lucky Luciano. Engrossed in the Castellamarese War, Maranzano and Masseria did not realize that Lucky Luciano was building a third force. On his side he had Meyer Lansky, a Jewish friend from childhood. Luciano's first step was to eliminate Joe the Boss Masseria. 5 months later, he killed Salvatore Maranzano as well. That didn't stop there. On the night of the 10th of September 1931, he took out all the other men still loyal to the 2 dead bosses. That night is remembered as the Sicilian Vespers. It marked the end of the Castellamarese War. In Atlantic City in 1929, the Godfathers, as if they were heads of state, gathered in a top-secret conference. The government takes care of public virtues. We take care of private vices, Luciano is reported to have told the other Godfathers. Business, he explained, required a stable environment. The drug market was growing, but they couldn't improvise. Sneaking past customs inspection required a high level of organization. They had to rely on corruption to buy the police and the judges.
If Cosa Nostra hadn't followed certain rules, it wouldn't be what it is.
Luciano established a round table for the Knights of Darkness, the Commission. Membership in this board of directors for the American Mafia required being recognized as a godfather that controlled a certain area. The boss of all bosses was abolished. No one ranked higher than anyone else. The commission was ruled by many bosses, all of whom were equal.
Joe Bonanno described it in his book, and described it to me when I interviewed him and questioned him, as being like the United Nations, which is a rather exalted way to describe it. But he thought of it as the heads of state coming together and trying to create a peaceful environment in which they could make the maximum amount of money.
Other members of the commission suggested Luciano gave a name to this criminal holding company. No names, he replied. No one can refer to this our thing, la cosa nostra. We'll be invisible. He also wanted to do away with rituals like finger pricking, collecting of blood drops, and the burning of pictures of saints. Meyer Lansky convinced him otherwise, telling him that young people needed rituals so they could believe in something, fear something.
The Mafia, without a degree of ritual and sacredness, would mean an entirely different criminal organization.
Because it had no name, Luciano's organization did not exist. Even FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was sure of it. In just a few years, history would give the Mafia new opportunities for business. And in that silence, the Mafia would prosper and grow. In 1929, the sudden crash of the stock market triggered the Great Depression. With millions unemployed, it was easier for the underworld to recruit men.
Cosa Nostra non è una banda di rapinatori.
Cosa Nostra is not a gang of bank robbers. It's not a series of gangsters all over the territory.
In 1933, in Washington, the Democrats won the election. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and prohibition ended. The new president announced there would be a New Deal. Lucky Luciano knew how to make it a New Deal for himself. As announced by Roosevelt, the New Deal meant dams, bridges, streets, railways. In other words, enormous contracts. The New Deal brought national labor contracts and labor union growth. The Godfathers were ready for the New Deal of racketeering.
Cosa Nostra è una
Cosa Nostra is a human phenomenon, made of organized men who want to rule the place they live in and want to make money. This has been the case since the beginning of Cosa Nostra.
Controlling the workers and directing the strikes entailed knowing how to ignite and quash them at the right time. That was the New Deal for the underworld, not the soup kitchen that Al Capone had opened.
By controlling labor's unions, they were able to control the trucking industry, construction industry, the docks along the eastern seaboard of the United States.
Ever since the Sicilian Fasci movement back at the end of the 19th century, the Godfathers had learned how to disguise themselves as union leaders. In 1930s America, their penetration into American labor unions became a dense tangle of contracts and racketeering, a tool to break into politics.
Politics is a tool that the Mafia uses to obtain its own objectives. The historical roots of the Mafia go back in history and feed off a counterculture of its own.
In the 1930s, through the labor unions, the Mafia found a way to corrupt politics.
Well, how do they corrupt you? With money. They give you money for your campaign. In return, you're supposed to forget about what's good for everybody and do what's good for me because I gave you the money. And a lot of that is very successfully done by big money in the United States of America. It should be no surprise, therefore, that the Mafia, which has its own organized crime, which has its own desires for its own business. We want to be able to reach a judge to make him more lenient in a case. Now that's pure corruption.
While the Great Depression frayed America, it did not affect the underworld. Lucky Luciano was living it up between nightclubs and stripteases. He began restructuring the prostitution ring, turning the brothels into supermarkets of sex. Women were his Achilles heel, and New York City's District Attorney Thomas Dewey spotted it. He convinced 2 of them to testify. He gathered enough evidence to arrest and try Luciano for abetting prostitution. On the 2nd of July 1936, the jury pronounced the word guilty 549 times. The sentence was 30 to 50 years in prison. His friend Meyer Lansky got word to him in prison that one of their soldiers planned to assassinate District Attorney Dewey. No attacks on government officials, the Godfather ordered. So Luciano saved the life of his prosecutor and showed the underworld that he maintained his power even from a prison cell. In 1922, Italy found itself under a fascist dictatorship. Benito Mussolini took power and called himself Il Duce. 2 years later, during a trip to Sicily, Mussolini met Don Ciccio Cuccia, a local godfather and town mayor. Don Ciccio said to Mussolini, "Your Excellency, you have no need for all these guards. Here you are under my protection, and nothing will happen to you." Another power other than fascism still existed in Sicily. To Mussolini, this was intolerable. It called for immediate action. He asked for an iron-fisted officer and was presented with the unrelenting Cesare Mori as chief of operations. The prefect of iron saw Sicily as an occupied enemy territory. Confident he was backed by the dictatorship, he sent in the army and ordered torture. 500 mafiosi managed to escape to the United States, aided by their American cousins. Those who remained in Italy faced hard times. Don Calogero Vizzini, the godfather who had prospered during the First World War with the sulfur mines, was brought to trial and sentenced to 5 years. But owing to his good relationship with the fascist regime, he was able to regain his freedom after just a few days in prison and return to his hometown of Villalba. With his investigation, Prefect Mori managed to enter the secret territory where contacts were kept with major banks and mafia families in America. Cesare Mori had gone far too far. The ancient Romans had a saying, "Let him be promoted and removed." By June 1929, Il Duce was satisfied with the results of Mori, and so was public opinion. The prefect of iron was promoted and left Sicily. Vito Genovese. One of Joe the Boss Masseria's young Turks had become a ruthless killer by the mid-1930s who had also gained control of many nightclubs and prostitution rings. In 1937, the New York Police Department issued a warrant for his arrest for the murder of Ferdinando Boccia. Genovese was forced to flee to Italy. He became much more than just a fugitive. Even under Italy's fascist regime, he was able to find new ways to do business.